Hey everyone. Welcome back to Strange Mind 6. I'm your host Ruby, and today we're going to be getting back into Beware the Claws That Catch Alice, written by Christina Henry. And we last left off on chapter 5. But before we begin, please hit that like button, hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. And as always, my dear friends, I hope you are doing well. I hope you are having a great morning, noon, afternoon, or night whenever this video reaches you. So, sit back, grab a snack, or grab a drink, and let's get into it. Chapter 5. She nodded, trying to look brave, though everything inside her quaked. I understand. You'll wish you were dead, he said. I remember, she said, her voice faint. I remember wishing that. I'll stay close, and I won't be a mouse. I'll be your brother. Hatcher nodded. Let's pack up the cloaks. They're noticeable, and we don't want the guards to pay us too much mind. Alice took off the cloak, with no small amount of regret, and shivered. She tugged her jacket close around her, and felt the weight of the little knife in her pocket. Hatcher spent a moment arranging things in the pack, and then said, I'll do the talking, if there's any to be done. She followed him, back into the street, her cap pulled low over her eyes, and stuck her hands in her pocket. Her fingers went around the handle of the knife and gripped it hard. The street ahead of them appeared deserted. She didn't see any sentries. Perhaps Hatcher imagined them in the fog. Then, as suddenly as if they'd crossed some tripwire, two men appeared out of the darkness, one from each side. Just where do you think you're going, lads? One asked. He was a little shorter than Hatcher, and had a blaze of white just above one eyebrow. It stood out in the stark relief against the darkness of his hair and the night. The two men formed a wall in front of Alice and Hatcher, their bodies saying quite clearly that nobody was going around without saying they're so. Alice felt a quick burst of relief that the man referred to her as a lad. Just passing through, Hatcher said. His head was up, staring directly into the face of the man in front of him. Not insolent, not daring, just not afraid. Alice thought it best to copy him. She lifted her chin and faced the man in front of her. He was around her age, or maybe even younger. His face was crusted with dirt and some rusty stains that might have been from splattered blood. Two of his bottom teeth were missing, and he held a long knife in his right hand. Alice thought that in a duel with her own blade he would win. He had the advantage of size. But then, you don't have to duel, do you? She thought. Just find somewhere soft and push it in as hard as you can, like you did before. The thought startled her. Before? When she'd escaped from the rabbit. She'd gotten lost in the tangle of memory for a moment. So she missed some of what passed between Hatcher and the man with the blaze, who seemed to be in charge. When she came back to where she was supposed to be, everything seemed more fraught than it had been a moment before. Like the air around them was a balloon slowly filling up with tension. The man in front of Alice, toothless, she thought, took a firmer grip on his knife. In her pocket, Alice did the same. The other man, Blaze, she thought of him, took 2 fingers and pushed at Hatcher's shoulder. I asked what you were doing here. No one passes through Mr. Carpenter's streets without his permission, and I'm the one that gives permission when he's not about. If you know what's good for you, you'll tell up and then pay up, and mayhap will let you through without too much damage. Hatcher did not speak. Alice darted a quick look at him. His face was blank. He thought, with a flare of terror, that the Jabberwock might be near, possessing him. Blaze pushed Hatcher's shoulder again. What's the problem, my lad? Are you daft? Hatcher's head moved slowly, like an automaton Alice had seen once, on and outgoing with her governess. He looked from Blaze's hand on his shoulder to the other man's face. Alice sucked in her breath. Hatch, no. But it was too late. The blade of the axe flashed in the dim light before anyone even knew it was there. Hatcher buried it in Blaze's throat, the force of the blow so great that the head tipped back, almost but not quite severed. Blood sputtered in a wild spray, splashing Alice's face. There was one motionless second where they all watched Blaze's body falling backwards, the head lolling in an unnatural curve. Then Toothless opened his mouth, and Alice thought, he'll raise the alarm. Before she had time to consider it, Hatcher was in front of her, his blade sliding into the other man's belly. The belly is soft, she thought, as he pulled the knife across quick as a wink, under the ribs, making a red gaping mouth there. Toothless stared at them in shock, his hands going to his stomach. His lips separated, but no noise came out. He fell to the ground like his friend, writhing and panting. Hatcher moved beside her, the bloody axe in one hand, his knife in the other. You can't leave them like that, he said, as if he were instructing a student. You have to do the job properly, or they come back for you. The axe flashed again, and Toothless stilled. What happened next was Hatcher wiped the blade on the inside of his coat, where the blood would not be so obvious. She uncurled her fingers that gripped the knife in her pocket. Her hand shook badly, so she fisted it at her side, willing it to be still. Let's go before someone else comes around, he said, leading her past the 2 bodies, his hand around her arm, guiding her. I thought the second man might raise an alarm. Hatcher looked at her sharply when she stuttered. And he would have, too. Don't regret what's done, Alice. We would have had to fight those 2, and more, if I hadn't killed them both. I don't, she said. Not really. I know they weren't good men. It's only what? Why did you kill that other man? Anyway, the second man would have yelled out if you'd left the first one alone. Alice was shocked to realize she was angry, terribly, terribly angry. She could not recall the last time she'd been angry, when she'd felt something other than fear and confusion and cold. I don't know, Hatcher admitted. He touched me, and then there was red in my eyes. I didn't really think about what I was doing. You were the one who told me to not draw attention, Alice hissed. Her voice was low, as was his. They both instinctively did so, unwillingly to attract any more notice than they already might have done. Hatcher had moved quickly away from the thoroughfare, darting into the nearby alley and continuing on wherever his mind said to go. I did, Hatcher said. You're right. It was a foolish thing to do, but it's done. And it's nearly dawn, so let's find a place to rest. A half hour earlier, Alice would have given anything for food and a warm bed. Now her blood ran so hot and busy she wasn't sure she would ever be able to sleep again. Where are you taking me? She asked. Hatcher gave her a sideways glance. I've never seen you mad before, Alice. It's brought some color to your cheeks. She grabbed his wrist then, though a small part of her knew it was dangerous to do so, dangerous to do anything so unpredictable. Around a man who'd just murdered someone for no particular reason. Stop treating me like a child, Alice said, yanking him around to look at her. There was a momentary flare in his eyes. Then it was banked, and she knew he would not hurt her. I know I've acted like a child. I know I've been helpless, but you just killed 2 men for no reason that I can see. You might have attracted more attention than I ever could, and I would be the one to pay for it. They stared at each other, Alice breathing hard. Her hand latched on his wrist, and Hatcher was still as the sea before the storm. Finally he moved, and his hand went to her cheek, the scarred one. You're like me deep down, he said, his eyes drawing her near, like a snake charmer from the east. You'll do what you must, I see that now. But me, Alice, I'll do what I must, and I'll do anything for you. No one would have taken you. I would have never let you pay for my mistake. His hand dropped and he turned away. Alice's fingers loosened on her own accord, letting him go. She wasn't entirely sure what had happened, but she knew her anger had run out of her, leaving her feeling deflated. She walked beside him, sensing something had shifted between them, but uncertain as to what that something was. The sun was coming up now, so far away its light piercing the fog, but not bringing in any heat to pierce the cold and damp. Hatcher paused as they reached the thoroughfare, busy with morning activities. Carts and sellers setting up for their trade. He pulled a handkerchief from his pocket and wet it with his tongue. You've blood on your face, he said, wiping her face with the same attention as a mother preparing her child for Sunday worship. You also. She took the handkerchief from him. It was the first time she'd really looked at him since he'd shaved off his madman's beard. Really took in the hollowness of his face, the shadows under his eyes. He was haunted, same as she was, except he didn't know the name of his ghost. Was there comfort in that, she wondered? Did it make it better or worse to know who or what chased you through your dreams? Hatcher indicated the pub across the way, and they crossed the street. The folk going about their morning business paid them no mind. A few bleary-eyed fellows staggered out of the pub in question. Hatcher slipped around them and Alice followed, blinking in the dim light as they entered. A middle-aged man wiped long wooden tables with a gray rag, and a woman of about the same age collected plates and glasses in a bucket. Both of them had the worn faces and knotted fingers that showed a lifetime of hard work. A much younger woman, younger than Alice, mopped the floor in lazy circles. The man looked up, frowning as the door shut behind Alice and Hatcher. "We're closed," he said, straightening. "Just chivied the last of the stragglers out." Hatcher didn't speak. He approached the man, who appeared to swell a little. Alice saw that despite his age, the forearms exposed by roll-up sleeves were thick and muscled. "I said we're closed," he repeated. Hatcher put 2 shiny silver coins on the table. The girl paused in her pretense of mopping and watched the proceedings with avid eyes. "We're looking for a room for the day," Hatcher said, his voice quiet, non-threatening, but Alice noticed he let his jacket fall open a little. The tavern's keeper's eyes flickered from the axe at Hatcher's waist and back to his face. "Dolly!" he shouted. The girl with the mop started, nudging the bucket and slushing gray water on the floor. "Take yourself back to the kitchen and get yourself a pie for breakfast before you leave." Dolly eagerly picked up the bucket, obviously pleased to be released before her task was complete. She stopped halfway to the kitchen, looking from Hatcher to Alice to the keeper. "What about me wages?" The older woman huffed, putting the dishes on a table. She hurried to the girl's side, muttering, "Come along, you ninny." They disappeared into the box, leaving the other 3 around the table. The keeper looked at the scar on Alice's cheek and then back at Hatcher. "I don't want no trouble with Mr. Carpenter." Hatcher reached into his pocket and doubled the number of coins. "We don't know, Mr. Carpenter. We just need a bed until nightfall and perhaps some food." The man looked at the coins on the table and back at Hatcher, who added 2 more. "You'll never even know we were here," he said. And Alice understood this to mean that the keeper was to forget them entirely after they left. The keeper nodded, scooping up the coins. "Up those stairs," he said, jerking his thumb over his shoulder. His eyes moved to Alice's shirt sleeve and saw the blood there, coating the cuff, which she hadn't noticed before. Hatcher's right hand, his axe hand, had it too, and along the back of his wrist. Alice supposed they should have done a better job of cleaning up. But then the blood seemed to help the tavern keeper take them more seriously than he otherwise would have. "My wife will bring you up some pies in a moment. Second room on the left. I can't vouch for the mattress. Some of the lads who come in take it for an hour." Alice paused on the steps behind Hatcher. "Don't worry," he said, not looking back. At the top of the stairs, there was a little turn and then a hallway that stretched back above the tavern floor. Hatcher opened the room and waved Alice in ahead of him. She exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. For a moment, she'd been afraid that they would come upon a man and woman in the act, but the room was empty. There was a dirty mattress on the floor, straw leaking from a hole in one side, a filthy wool blanket was tossed at the floor. Alice had spent 10 years sleeping on the floor in the asylum, but she shuddered when she saw the foul bed. "You don't have to sleep there," Hatcher said solicitously. "I'm not certain I can sleep at all," she said. "You have to try and get some rest," he said. "Maybe after you eat something you'll feel calmer." A small, dusty window let in the faint sunlight. Alice went and looked out at the alley below. Hatcher joined her. "Useful," he said. "You can see the back entrance from here, and right down onto the tavern floor from the door." "Do you think someone will come looking for us?" Hatcher shook his head. "Who's to know? We are the ones that killed those 2 guards. It was dark." "Someone could have seen," Alice said, thinking of the buildings all around, with their windows that hid watchful eyes. "They would have followed us then," he said. "Any soldiers of Mr. Carpenter would have raised the alarm on us right away, and any looking to curry flavor with him would have tracked us here." "How do you know nobody did?" Alice asked. She felt restless and strangely trapped. She wasn't certain she could fit through that dirty little window, skinny as she was, if they needed to get away, and the stairs could be blocked. "Don't worry, Alice," he said. He lay on the bare floor, away from the mattress, and tucked the pack behind his head. He held out one arm to her. "Come and sleep." "Not yet," she said, watching the activity under a window. A grubby-looking girl of 12 or 13 approached a man, smoking a cigarette. They talked for a moment. Then the girl took the man's hand and led him away to the shadows. Alice turned away, feeling sick to her stomach. The tavern keeper and his wife seemed all right, but she couldn't get rid of the feeling that they weren't safe here. "Hatch, don't you think something's wrong?" "No," he said, pulling his cap low over his eyes. A moment later his breathing was deep and even. He always slept like that, Alice thought. He would be wide awake and talking to her through the mouse hole, and then suddenly the talking would cease and she'd hear the sound of his breathing, smooth and regular, except when the Jabberwock was awake. When the Jabberwock was awake, he couldn't sleep at all. There was a soft knock at the door, and Alice remembered the landlady was going to bring them some pies. But it might not be her, she thought. She pulled the knife from her pocket and kept it low against her thigh. As she opened the door a small crack, the tavern keeper's wife stood there holding a tray covered with a piece of flour sacking, and she expressed no surprise at Alice's caution. "Pies?" she said. Alice nodded, tucking the knife back into her jacket before opening the door. She took the tray from the lady, murmuring, "Thanks." The woman peered over Alice's shoulder at the sleeping Hatcher. "That your man?" "Yes," without thinking. Then her eyes widened in terror because she was supposed to be a boy. The woman shook her head. "Don't worry, I won't tell." "How did you know?" Alice asked, her voice low. She was worried that Hatcher might not be completely asleep, that he may have overheard. If he had, there was no telling what he might do. He could decide to pay the keeper and his wife to keep their mouths shut, or he might think killing them was easier. Hatcher was not easy to predict. The fact that was clear was after his actions with the guard. Alice didn't want to leave a trail of bodies behind them all the way to Cheshire's place. If anyone were following them, the bodies would be better than breadcrumbs. "I was like you once," she said, her eyes full of understanding. "My Harry saved me, kept me safe all these years. You can trust us." There was a history in those few sentences. The story of a girl who'd been taken and used like Alice, only Alice didn't remember who had saved her from her captor. She might have had help. She might have saved herself. The feeling of a knife in flesh had felt so similar and so familiar. Still, Hatcher had rescued her from the asylum and from the traitors who had, or would have, taken her the moment she was free from there. "I don't think others will know what you are unless they're looking for a girl," the woman went on. "But they won't find a girl here." Alice met her eyes and shared understanding passed between them. "Thank you," she said, her voice trailing off into a question. "Nell," the woman said. "Thank you, Nell," Alice said. "Now, you eat up those pies," Nell said. "I've got the sense. You have some traveling ahead of you. Are you running from Mr. Carpenter?" Alice shook her head. "He told your husband true. We don't know Mr. Carpenter." Nell wisely did not ask. Nell wisely did not ask whom they had escaped or where they were heading. She nodded and went away down the stairs. Alice sat on the floor with a tray in her lap and pulled off the sacking. She'd half expected something greasy and half cooked, automatically assuming that the quality of food would not be so remarkable in this part of the city. But the pies she uncovered smelled heavenly, and the pastry that wrapped them was golden brown and flaky, which meant Nell used lots of butter in them. Alice knew that because as a child she'd spent many an afternoon in the kitchen, watching cook magically, turning flour and water and butter and a little sugar and salt into delicious pies. She bit into the crust, savoring the melting buttery taste on her tongue. The pie was stuffed with meat and gravy and potatoes, the smell of it taking her back again, until she was just 4 or 5 years old, perched on a chair, eating a bun while cook stirred the pot on the stove. She finished the pie before she knew it, and looked longingly at the second one on the tray, before wrapping it in the piece of sacking and tucked it in her jacket pocket. Hatcher would want it when he woke. Alice knew she should sleep, knew that Hatcher would push the pace when nightfall fell. She was eager to escape Mr. Carpenter's territory. The uneasy feeling stayed with her, growing despite Nell's assurances that they were safe. Something was coming, and Alice was sure of it. But Hatch is a seer, and he doesn't think anything is wrong, she thought. But it was just nerves. There had been nothing except stress and danger since they'd emerged from the poisoned river, and now that they were a few moments away from that danger. She couldn't shake it. "Sleep, little butterfly," she whispered, pulling her jacket close around her and crossing her arms, the cap tilted low over her eyes like Hatcher's, but she did not lie down. She was under the window and across from the door, feeling that if something came through either opening, she would immediately know. "And what's coming through the window, you nit?" she thought. She noted herself that it was too small for any but a child to fit through. "Sleep, little butterfly," she repeated and closed her eyes, humming the tune softly. She did not expect to fall asleep, but she must have, for she woke later with Hatcher's hand on her arm, his face close to hers in the darkness. The darkness had a different quality, the dark of falling night. They must have slept all day, or at least Alice had, and Hatcher allowed it. She could just make out the fingers over his lips, silently telling her to stay quiet. Alice shook off the dream that clung to the edges of her brain. Something about cake. She'd eaten the cake and gotten very tall, so tall she'd filled up the room. Hatcher moved away from her, tiptoeing to the door. The pack was already slung over his shoulder, the axe in his hand. Alice slowly came to her feet and followed him, stepping carefully so the floor would not creak, until she was at his shoulder. Now she could hear the sounds of struggling downstairs, glass breaking, benches falling over. Hatcher turned the knob on the door and eased it open a tiny crack, just enough to peer over the balcony and down into the tavern room. There were 5 men there, all of them wearing with muscle and wielding knives. There were 2 other men near their feet who looked like they might have been customers. They would not be customers any longer. Both of the men had slashed throats. The attackers appeared to be untouched. They also seemed to be better kept than the sentries Alice and Hatcher killed earlier. Their faces were clean, as were their clothes. They were all dressed in a kind of uniform, blue coats and gray pants, and black bowler hats. The intruders formed a loose half-circle around Harry, who stood in front of Nell and Dolly, his hands curled up in fists. Nell had her arm around the girl, who was shaking with terror, her mouth open in a slight scream. There was no one else visible. Alice assumed that the other patrons had fled. She put her mouth close to Hatcher's ear, speaking so low only a mouse could hear. "Do you think they're from Mr. Carpenter's, looking for us?" Hatcher shook his head once, no, and then cupped his hand over his ear to indicate they should listen. The man in the middle of the group spoke. He didn't look different from the rest of the men, but he had clearly been designated the leader. "The walrus is taking over this street, and as you can see," the man said, nudging one of the bloody corpses with the toe of his boot, "the terms of your agreement may be different from your terms with Mr. Carpenter." Alice took an instant dislike to the man. It wasn't the posture and bullying. She'd seen that already, and would see it again, but the oily smugness of his tone made her back teeth grind. Someone should teach him a lesson, she thought, and she felt the handle of her knife under her hand. I pay Mr. Carpenter 30% of the takings, plus the rent, Harry said. Anything more, and we won't be able to eat, nor pay the girl wages. 30%? Well, that is quite generous of Mr. Carpenter. Unfortunately, the walrus is not quite so generous. 40% is where he starts, and your books will be checked by Alan here every week. He gestured toward the man next to him, who did not look like he knew very much about figures, in Alice's opinion, but perhaps the blank snake's look was what the walrus wanted in a number checker. 40%? Harry said, his voice hoarse with outrage. I might as well close up shop and leave. We've barely enough to get by as it is. The leader of the little gang slid forward, touching the tip of his knife with his finger. He looked at Harry, the position of the knife suddenly more purposeful, and Alice thought the blade would slide right between Harry's ribs, smooth as a spoon through jam. I don't think it will be so difficult for you to make 40%, the man said, and pointed the knife toward Nell and Dolly. Especially since these two will be coming with us, and that will be 2 less mouths to feed. For you to concern yourself with. Dolly did scream then, a howl of fear that chilled Alice to the marrow of her bones. No, no, I won't go to the walrus. I won't go. He'll eat me. And that is where we are going to leave it, my dear friends. Tune in next video to hear what happens in chapter 6. As always, my dear friends, this has been Ruby, signing off.